Indian country very well. He's not a father, but I'm pretty sure he could give us some insight into some of the experiences that fathers experience, or parents in general, in Indian country. Welcome, Joseph.
Thanks, Charles. It's excellent to be here. I'm excited to be in conversation with you, and thanks for the invitation. Just excited to be here with you. It's great.
I love you, man.
Yeah,
I love you.
Too,
I brag about Joseph all the time, but Joseph, can you tell us what you do and don't hold back? You're too humble.
Yeah, so I'm a citizen of the Northern Cheyenne Nation. I'm trained as an architect, planner, designer. I lead a portfolio of work called the Sustainable Native Communities Design Lab. We're a nonprofit design firm housed within Mass Design Group, which stands for a model of architecture serving society. And we firmly believe that the built environment, architecture is not neutral. It has the ability to harm or heal communities. And in many instances, in the communities we work, architecture has contributed to generations of hurt, whether it's housing, healthcare, education, our built environment, and that hasn't necessarily lifted up our cultures, our communities, our people. And so how can we leverage architecture to really think clearly about highlighting the injustices, the inequities that we've seen historically, and how can we leverage it for the good? So how do we design culturally responsive housing that reflects a people, a culture, a place? So we're working on projects across the board, and I'm very fortunate enough to be part of a firm, a cohort of 120 architects, engineers, planners, designers that really focus on changing the narrative around architecture and what architecture could do for those that haven't historically had access to this profession. So,
gosh, I just love Joseph, and I knew Joseph was going to do this, so I'm going to do it now. Okay, so Joseph's going to hold back because he's not going to tell you everything, but he was also on the design team for Brian Stevenson's museum in Mississippi. Is that Mississippi, Alabama?
It's Alabama.
Alabama.
Yeah.
Yep. So he had a small but very important part in the design of that. Also, he's doing some work here in Boston. I'm just so honored to know you, my friend. And also, he just published an op-ed in The Hill, as well as Aspen published an op-ed on some of his work. So he's doing his thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, man. He's so humble, right? But I just had to tell the world just about the great work that he's doing all over. But before we go into the conversation a little bit, Joseph, I have a question for you, man. So I know you're not a father yet, but my fun dad question would be, when you have your kid, what is going to be the first thing that you say when you see them come out of your wife?
Oh, wow. Yeah. What will the first thing be? I mean, in many ways, I'll probably be speechless. It would be such an honor and privilege to be a father. And I think the love and gratitude that I'd express, I maybe just at this point can't put into words, because I know it will be a very special moment that words can't describe at this point.
You know what, man? I'm going to tell you my first words. There were 2 words. It was a very special moment. Mm-hmm. The 2 words when I first saw my son was, "Oh shit."
Yeah.
Brother, when you see that experience, it's an experience like no other, but at the same time, there's love, but also shock. Almost fainted.
I can imagine.
Right? One guy told me he had post-traumatic stress disorder when he saw his child come out. Yeah. He said it hasn't been the same since. I don't want to scare you, right? But I mean, it's a wonderful and loving experience, and at the same time, it shocks the hell out you.
Yeah, well, there's such an obligation, and I can imagine that the weight of what does it mean to care for, take care of, and create an environment for this human being to thrive and live in this crazy world.
Yeah.
It's intense.
It is, man, but it's a beautiful thing, and you're going to be a great father. I already see it already, man. I see it already. Yeah. I know a good father when I see one.
Yeah.
So, question for you, man. I can tell you what expectations of fathers are growing up in a country that is fully capitalistic, and at the same time, some of the expectations that are placed on fathers, just in general. And I'm not sure if it's the same in Indian country, but here, in our community, in Atlanta, Georgia, where I was born, Riverdale, Georgia, what I learned about a father's role was they need to be strong and they need to provide. Based on growing up in Indian country, what are some of the expectations that, individuals are taught about their role as fathers growing up? Is it the same or is it different? Like, what's some of the things that are projected onto them or poured into them?
Yeah, I mean, as a cultural leader, so I'm a citizen of the Northern Cheyenne Nation, what is now southeastern Montana, and I think it is seen as a matriarchal society. So the women hold a very strong role within the community. The men's, I think the running joke is the women own everything, right? And so, historically, the men basically went out, hunted, gathered. They were the cultural bearers, and then the women just provided what was the home. And if you were kicked out, you were basically left with nothing as a man. And so I think how that translates into today's world, it's how can we work in harmony, both men and women, to kind of lift up the next generation. And I think today it's very much around making sure that you're culturally strong, you understand where you're coming from, that you have a connection to place, a connection to community, and you just understand what does it mean to be, in my instance, Northern Cheyenne, or what does it mean to be indigenous and indigenous to a place. And to also, for me personally, to acknowledge too that while I am a citizen of the Northern Cheyenne Nation, my father is German and Italian, and so my mom was Northern Cheyenne. So what does it mean to come from a kind of a biculturally biracial family, and what would that look like for my future generations?
Yeah.
And so that, I think that's important to acknowledge and lift up and celebrate.
Yeah. And, it's interesting, maternal focus, right? And, men being left with nothing, and now they're trying to work together to change that system. I'm curious about just how does father absenteeism show itself as a result of, the systemic inequities in your community? Because here I can tell you, child support enforcement. I can tell you about navigating family and probate court. I can tell you that fathers outside of the household are typically judged when they can't, pay the child support payment, or them and the mother don't get along. The mother has the power, right? How does that look, from your vantage point?
I think it's very similar in Indian country. I also look at the systems of oppression that have historically just been part of the narrative of Indian country. The lack of housing, the lack of healthcare, the lack of education, all those, I think, when brought together, don't offer much of a vision of what the future could hold, right? And so I think what we're focused on is changing what that looks like. How do we change these systems of oppression? How do we provide homes, not just housing, but the kind of concept of going home, your home? We've been working on something called the Innovo Fund, which is the Cheyenne word for your home, to provide opportunities to think about the home and what a family, what a father, what a mother can do to contribute to that. I think it's just, it is so crucial to be thinking critically about changing and thinking about what does it mean to provide in these communities.
Now, there's a rumor out there, and I've heard this, and I really enjoy the communal approach, but I've heard this rumor about Indian country that there's a lot of fathers that suffer from alcoholism, that it prevents them from being engaged fathers. Is that true? Is there a high prevalence of alcoholism in Indian country?
Well, I mean, I would say yes. There's a large dependency not only on alcohol but substance abuse. In my community, there is a high usage of substance abuse, alcoholism. I think I contribute that to, again, those systems of oppression, right? You're in a very rural place. You don't have access to jobs. You don't have access to a ways or a means of providing. So your only outlet are those outlets, alcohol, substance abuse. And so in many ways, it's like, how do we, it's so complicated. And when we think about fixing, I would say changing the systems, reset. We don't want to just fix, we want to kind of revamp and redesign how we think about how we work in these spaces. And our tribal youth suffer from a high rate of suicide. That's due to absent fathers, absent mothers, because there's no reason for being. And so how do we change that outlook? I mean, outside of any other demographic, natives or indigenous populations in the U.S. have the highest rates of suicide in terms of youth or indigenous youth. And so we really need to change how we think about parenting, fathering, and being present and being at the table. And it starts at the home.
Yeah. And just from your personal experience, I mean, your relationship with your father in Indian country. You were raised in Indian country?
No. So I was raised in New Jersey.
Yeah.
Went back and forth between New Jersey and Montana. And so I got a view into Indian country, but I was always kind of disconnected. And so how in many ways it's a privilege and a disconnect from one's culture. And so I think I've spent my years in college and undergrad in graduate school trying to reconnect and understand what is that connection back to my indigenous roots, indigenous roots, and think about ways to take the privilege that I've had to go to schooling and education and develop a career, and what does that mean to bring back to my community, knowing that there's an indigenous way of thinking. I'm trained as an architect, planner, designer. That's a Western Eurocentric way of thinking. So
yeah, wow. So you kind of have this dual perspective. You know how Indian country looks on the outside, and you know how it looks on the inside.
Yeah.
What is something that we need to know on the outside looking in about dads or individuals in Indian country in general? I think we have our assumptions about their ideals, how they view parenting. I mean, what do we need to know?
Mm-hmm. I mean, that we are, we are just another peoples that belong to place, that belong to culture, a community that is indigenous to a place, and that is, I think, an outlook on how we communicate. A lot of the times it's when you think about Indian country, it's about we and not I. Like how are we as a people contributing to a greater society? And I think that's really important, because it puts more pressure on the me, because in many ways I have an obligation to work towards a better society within my community, within our indigenous populations, and so I feel that obligation to do more rather than just provide for me individually. And so those principles, those values, I think would translate to what does it mean to be a parent, does it mean to provide for a collective rather than an individual?
Could that put more pressure on the dad to feel as if they have to provide more so for a collective than just an individual?
I'd say sure. Yeah, no, it's a lot of pressure. But I mean, historically, I would say that parents stepped up to the challenge, right? So my great grandfather, Arthur Woodenthigh, had many kids. My mom's grandfather, and he actually adopted a white boy that was left behind.
Really?
Wow. He kind of bring a non-native and raise this white child.
How did that work out? That's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I have a picture of it at home of Arthur and the family, and then this little white boy, and I'm just like, what is going on? And I wanted to know the story, and to take in a child, I see that as pretty powerful.
Absolutely.
And to raise that child as a Northern Cheyenne. So this concept of being indigenous and having blood quantum. So I'm quote unquote 50% Northern Cheyenne, right? So I have 50% Northern Cheyenne blood in me. And it says it on my tribal ID, my citizen ID. And but to be, I think, indigenous, to raise this child as Northern Cheyenne, like that child is Northern Cheyenne now. Raised in a culture, raised in a place, and now identifying as being from that place. And so I think those are the values that we pass on. Those are the values that we want to instill, that you are part of the community. My grandfather, Father Emmett Hoffman, was non-native. He was a Catholic priest that adopted my mother, who was Northern Cheyenne, and raised her. Father Emmett became a part of our he became a chief within our tribe. So, and again, a non-native chief within our tribe is pretty powerful.
I did not know that happened.
Yeah,
Are there many cases where?
No, I think he's one of two.
Wow.
And I don't think that will probably ever happen again. But you can share culture, you can kind of share ways of being and ways of belonging. And I think that's something to pass down. And I mean, how do you, I would pose a question, like, how do you raise your children, your child as part of like the community? Like,
I struggle with that because I never really felt part of a community outside of, my mother and my brothers, but I never really felt a part of it. So, my story, I was born as a result of a marital affair, and I always kind of found myself trying to search for community, but even when community was in front of me, I couldn't fully embrace it. So I haven't really thought about how do I raise my child to be a part of a community, but I do protect him from this fear or illusion of not being a part of the community. And, I don't really, from my journey as a Black man in America, to be honest with you, man, I think that's one of the things that I really envied about individuals that really knew their culture. Because all I knew was that my great-great-grandmother was a slave in Georgia. But I don't know where I'm from, outside of Georgia, Florida. My mom them don't know. It's like you're searching for a community. I think that's the thing in my whole life. Searching for a community for my whole life. Searching for community, but can't find it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But I really like this notion that how granddad brought Arthur in and made him a part of the community, even though he wasn't blood per se. The culture embraced him. And I'm looking for that. I think being an Obama fellow, I found that. Right. I mean, for my majority of my life, I found you, 18 other amazing people.
Yeah.
So first time I've ever felt as if I'm a part of a community that's bigger than just my personal experiences where I've been through. So I'm still trying to figure out the answer to that question. How do I make my son feel as if he's a part of the community when I'm still trying to find mine? I found one.
Yeah.
It satisfies me a little bit, but it's not necessarily fulfilling for that void. And I think that's going to be a void I have my entire life. But
yeah, I mean, I think that's also a question that I also I confront and I struggle with. Growing up in New Jersey, I was fortunate enough to be in one town growing up and didn't move, but I did go back and forth between Montana, but I'd always go back to this small town called Point Pleasant, New Jersey, and I grew up with a group of kids that were white. They were white, and I was like Indian, Native, Italian, German. They didn't know much of the time what my background was, but they accepted me as their peers, right? It wasn't really until I went away to college that changed. They wanted to know, they knew you weren't white. They knew I wasn't Black. They were like, are you Hispanic? Like, what are you? And that's the first time I had to kind of come up with a story about identity and this notion of identity. And I kind of fell back on my indigenous roots. I was like, I know I'm Native. I can talk about that. And so I think if I were to parent, or when I am to parent, I'd really push on that notion of identity and reinforcing one's sense of identity and belonging, that I belong. And that's not necessarily something that I grew up understanding. And I think because maybe those that have the privilege of growing up in society without having to worry about safety and policing and all these other things that we're seeing happening right now, that you can focus on who you are as an individual. Like, you can be that quarterback football player, you could be that science nerd and not have to worry about you. I mean, of course there's bullying and all this other stuff, but
yeah.
You
know what, Joseph, I love that. And I think those are two questions. I belong and I'm valuable are two questions that, do I belong and do I value? Am I valuable? Those are two questions that I find myself navigating and wrestling with. But I think that's very important, really imparting that onto your children. The fact that you do belong and you are valuable and you have, like you said before, the opportunity to create and be whatever you want to be while worrying about those things that we have to worry about, being a Black man, or, being a part of Indian country, so, wow. So some of y'all may be wondering, what does that have to do with absent for a reason? A lot. I mean, Joseph just gave us a glimpse inside of Indian country and also his personal experience. And then he just turned it back on me and asked me some few questions about community and belonging. And I had to be real and vulnerable because that's my truth. But at the end of the day, one thing that I'm taking away from this conversation with Joseph is that, regardless of if you are within a community or feel as if you're outside the community, you both have an opportunity to create the community that you want to be a part of, to complement or to go against wherever you have came from or whatever you know as a community. And the most important thing is that you have an opportunity to pass that along to your children. So I'm taking that away. And I'm also taking away the fact that Indian country, there's individuals like Joseph's grandfather who embrace other individuals who were not from that community to be a part of his community. And I can only imagine how challenging it was to grandfather to have to go against other people who said, well, you're not keeping up with the old customs, or, but, Arthur was a part of the community. Wow. Powerful. Joseph, any last words for us before we close?
Yeah. I mean, I just kind of dwell on what does it mean to create a sense of identity, a sense of place, and that you have the opportunity to design that as a father, as a parent, as a person. You have the power. There is power there that you can leverage as a parent, and to create those safe spaces, to design those spaces, however privileged or marginalized you are. So I think that's a huge opportunity.
Great, Joseph. Thank you, man. As we close, for my Black brothers out there, Black dads, you may think that Indian country is another world, but we're more alike than we are different. And if you're a white father, Asian father, wherever you are, we may have community issues. But hopefully a glimpse inside of Indian country from Joseph's perspective gave you some insight to know that we're not as different as we think we are. So thank you for coming and joining us this week at AFAR. Don't go too far. We will see you next week. Absent for a Reason podcast.